As President-elect Donald Trump takes office for a second term, Africa is watching to see if there will be a shift or continuity in U.S. Africa policy. In his first term, Trump adopted a more hands-off approach to Africa, while under Joe Biden, the U.S. attempted to step up cooperation. In view of this apparent inconsistency, some analysts have characterized U.S. Africa policy as a mixed bag. Others say it lacks clarity. So this week on the program, we ask, in a shifting geopolitical world where Africa is a center of interest to global powers, will Trump prefer a hands-off policy or choose to engage with the continent? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Well, as the dust settles on the U.S. elections, Africa has received news of Trump's victory with mixed reaction. Before we begin our discussion, let's take a listen. As Donald Trump makes his comeback as America's 47th president, 4 years after he left the White House, there has been a mixed reaction across Africa. In the streets of Lagos in Nigeria, some residents say while Trump may have his critics in liberal circles, they feel they know what they can expect from him.
The reason is that he has more idea of how to run those things. Though he may be someone that talks too much. Yes, he may be someone that talks too much, that has almost whatever he wants to do, he has been saying it. Instead of having some kind of hidden agenda, he don't have any hidden agenda. He wants to say everything he wants to do. He's just someone like that. But he's someone that wants to work.
And the reason why Africans like Trump is that Trump did not support this LGBT and what have you, and he's a principled man that's never sent his out and everything.
In Dakar, Senegal, some believe the Trump win will benefit Africa.
So regarding Africans, everything suggests that Africans support him. And in fact, I personally believe that his coming and becoming the new president of the United States could truly change things.
As for immigration, he may be strict, but today each country needs to rediscover itself. We as Africans need to retain our youth. We really need our young people. We just need to train them, help them find their footing, and then ultimately build our countries because we need it.
However, in Johannesburg, South Africa, there's not the same optimism with some students. They're not sure how the current government will cooperate with Trump.
I don't know. I think with finance and, currency-wise, it might affect it, but depends on how President Ramaphosa and how our government is able to work with them as well. So, yeah, I'm very iffy about it.
But others say he will do well for his country.
I think Trump is a good president for Americans. I believe in his wisdom.
Some commentators on the continent speculate that a Trump administration would likely take what they call a transactional and practical approach towards Africa, believing that he is likely to focus mainly on economic issues. Sharon Baranga, CGTN.
Thank you all very much. This is great.
Well, joining me now to unpack what U.S. Africa policy may be under Trump are from Abuja, David Otto-Endele, Director, Geneva Center for Africa Security and Strategic Studies. From Kampala, Joseph Ochieno, African Affairs Commentator, and from Johannesburg, Chris Hatting, Executive Director, Center for Risk Analysis. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Let me start by getting an overview from all of you. Donald Trump has been elected America's 47th president, his second term. First, what is your interpretation of what a Trump win means for Africa? David, let me start off with you.
Donald Trump, President Trump-elect, has won the second term, and precisely, what a lot of Africans are expecting is to see what a Trump 2.0 is going to look like. There are several angles that one can look into this. First, from a diplomatic point of view, African countries and leaders, from the likes of South Africa, Nigeria, Zimbabwe, they've all sent their congratulations to the president, talking about issues of being ready to engage with the new Trump administration. They've talked about reciprocal economic and development partnership. And those are very critical issues. But again, of course, one has to not just look at what the president-elect has talked about when he was campaigning, but of course, if you look at the precedents, him being, elected since 2016 for that full term, then of course it may give you an idea as to what the African U.S. relationship is going to look like. And from Trump's own perspective, one can readily say that he runs America as an American first, and that is in line with the Republican policy when it comes to Africa. So we may see some certain engagements in terms of funding projects. We may see some increase in some areas, and we're possibly going to see some decrease in some areas. I mean, of course, the AGOA is going to be, the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act could be one of those areas where, there will be perhaps, some changes, also in terms of, cutting down certain fundings.
So we're going to look at that a little bit later in this program. But Chris, I want to get your input here first.
I think it's important to keep in mind the context of Trump 2.0 is different from under his first presidency and administration. You've got heightened conflict in different areas around the world, more geopolitical tensions. Trump likes to style himself as a deal maker. So as my colleague pointed out, the rhetoric on the campaign trail might be different from the actual policies that are implemented. He'll want to look for win-win solutions, ideas like that. I think it's vitally important for African countries, African governments and citizens to keep in mind they needn't go to a second Trump presidency, Trump administration with sort of a hand outreached, a begging bowl. Africa has to its advantage growing demographics, growing populations, over time more developing and sophisticated infrastructure. And for a country like the United States with potentially lower growth on the horizon, they need to think carefully about how they engage with individual African countries, not seeing the continent as just one entity and all African governments and policymakers thinking the same, but where can they also bring value from their side to the table? Right.
So, Joseph, let me come to you on this. Your interpretation of a Trump win for Africa, what do you think?
It's an extraordinary one, indeed, because amazingly, I'm not sure many Africans have really paid much attention to who Donald Trump is and what he was, and basically, in any case, what he basically means for them, except that many Africans seem to have responded to Donald Trump slightly much more emotively. People were looking, ironically, to my surprise actually, on things to do with abortion rights versus LGBT rights, and possibly the Trump that would be a guy who would be indifferent to Africa and to allow Africans to do whatever they so wished. Now, at strategical as a policy level, I'm not quite sure that this is necessarily very good for the continent. If you look at Donald Trump's own view on global polity today, and particularly if Donald Trump is someone who's not willing to have a multilateral conversation with the rest of the world, including in his relation with the EU, something that whatever happens, and I know Africans will be surprised that I'm saying this, impacts on Africa. Right. If you look at the question of the wars, particularly in Ukraine, it's very important that Africans possibly focus slightly more than they're doing. That sort of is the immediate reaction that I got. In any case, many people did not expect him to be this time.
So, David, let's take a step back for a moment and very briefly to the last 4 years of the Biden administration. What characterized U.S. policy on Africa? How has it been implemented?
Well, of course. I mean, for me, when I look at the Biden administration, I think, the U.S. policy has been one, of engaging. But at the same time, if, for example, you look at areas of security, where the U.S. has suffered, because, of course, the fragility, the environment that the U.S. faces now with competition, from countries like China and Russia, the U.S., has been, actually didn't perform as much as they would have wished to. I mean, for example, they had problems in countries like Chad, they were kicked out of Niger. The U.S. is struggling to re-engage itself in other African countries. So it's a different environment in which, the new administration would find itself. I mean, when Trump was in power in 2016 for that 4-year period, the dynamics of geopolitics was not as intense as we have it now. And this is why, comparatively, we have seen the Biden administration, has suffered tremendously because, of course, it has found itself in a scenario where there is huge competition. There is also the BRICS nations, coming up very strongly. So we have a completely different environment now as compared to when Trump was the president at the time. So I think the African countries do have a much more stronger position now than when Trump was. So the dynamics are quite different. And I think the engagement as well, has to take that tune. If the music has changed, I think Trump also has to change the dance.
So, Chris, on that question of how Africa should engage with Trump 2.0's time, how do you think they should engage?
I think if you look at things like unlocking more investments, if you look at facilitating trade flows, preferential access to U.S. markets. So as my colleague mentioned, the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act up for renewal in 2025. From the African government side and African citizen side, pushing for the priorities, the values that they want to see in those relationships with a second Trump administration. So if there are new bilateral agreements, if there are engagements on the global stage on platforms like the G20, to make sure that priorities identified by African governments and by the African Union are taken seriously on those platforms and given support by a country like the United States with the influence that it does have. South Africa, of course, has the presidency of the G20 for the year of 2025 and then hands over to the United States in 2026. So there's lots of potential overlap and building of common ground. As I mentioned, the trade agreements and investment agreements. I think there's quite a bit of scope to work on. But again here, African governments shouldn't come from feeling from the position of they need the US more than the US needs Africa, I think.
Right. So, Joseph, I do want to come back to the question of what will happen to AGOA, because during his 2024 campaign, President-elect Trump pledged to implement a universal 10% income tariff on all foreign-made goods. The big question now, however, for the continent is the future of AGOA, which expires in 2025. What does this mean? What does this mean for Africa?
I believe that Trump will continue generally with whatever he will have found, as I said at the beginning. But that said, really, my focus has been that perhaps this should be a wake-up call for the continent, that I think we should be looking much more inward. In any case, I think, as my previous colleague had said, the size of the trade with the U.S., considering the competition that now Africa, the U.S. is facing from new markets like China and Russia and others, I think as long as we're able to consolidate our trade domestically as a continent, and in as long as we're able to remainstream, our trade balances with countries like China and the rest of the world, America will have to play ball. It's an imperative game for them. But whatever the case, I think also Trump will come into a reality. His tone, really, this time round, immediately after the elections, part of his victory speech, seems to be slightly much more different from the campaign speech, and certainly different from Trump of the last time. So maybe the Trump of today may be somebody who's much more willing to have a conversation with officials, and maybe be looking at some of these positions changing going forward. That's a conversation I've been having with some friends, including some of the friends within the U.S. administration.
All right, gentlemen, we're going to take a short break now. When we come back, we will continue our discussion on U.S. Africa policy under Donald Trump. To stay with us. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Still with me are David Otto Endele, Joseph Ochieno, and Chris Hatting. Let's now continue our discussion on U.S. Africa policy under Donald Trump. Chris, under Joe Biden, South Africa came under increasing pressure because of its stance on the Israel-Gaza war and the Ukraine-Russia conflict. Is this pressure likely to continue for South Africa under Trump, or are we likely to see a thawing of relations?
I think on the diplomatic relations side, you could still see some elements of tension. Maybe on the trade side, you could see a shifting and maybe certain priorities coming to the fore. So for the South African government, I think it's important to practice what it preaches. So in things like non-alignment, on neutrality, if it can practice those and use the influence that it does extend in diplomacy around the world, that does stand it in good stead, even if that might then, quote unquote, frustrate a Trump administration. So I think it's important also to keep in mind that sometimes, sort of smoke and mirrors and signaling and more inflammatory rhetoric, when one particular government does that, the intention is also somewhat to try and see how others react. But the US, I think, also should realize, and under a second Trump administration, that engaging with sovereign governments and sovereign countries on the African continent, it can, of course, express its concerns around how some of these governments engage on the global sphere. But at the same time, those governments are sovereign and they have their own priorities. So I think you could see a little bit of a thawing, but I don't see just yet a radical sort of step change, as it were, between the South African government and the US government, at least in terms of things like the conflict currently on the go still in Gaza.
So, Joseph, I want to look at some U.S. past presidential initiatives, because Ronald Reagan had what he called constructive engagement, primarily dealing with South Africa, apartheid South Africa. President Clinton sponsored the AGOA Act. George Bush established the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, PEPFAR. Barack Obama had what he called Power Africa and Feed the Future initiatives. Donald Trump's first term, as we've ascertained, was said to be lukewarm on Africa. Will the second Trump term bring a drastic shift in U.S.-Africa relations compared to his first?
I think it is the hope of most of Africa, considering the position America holds on the globe thus far, that he changes and that he faces a reality that the world has changed, and as my colleagues have said, and that perhaps also many of his traditional allies in Europe and other places will possibly be banging tables. But back to Africa, I think, unfortunately, this is a president for whom, reference to Africa is fairly strong words, or certainly before. I'm not quite sure why it would be massively different this time. But of course, also, he's a president who's really managed to come back as a symbol of American exceptionalism. And if that is the case, and it actually gave him the votes, it is actually arguable that he will feel that there is possibly no reasons for him massively to please anybody, if you want to call it pleasing, except his traditional base, and then to leave a track record that, well, he did govern. But there is hope, though, that while America matters at the top, as I said, some of the bilateral and indeed multilateral arrangements with the continent, including some of the security arrangements, strategic security arrangements on the continent, will compel him to face the reality of the world today. Because, yes, the reality is that increasingly Africans are saying that, look, America is just like any other global power. And yes, perhaps, it is possible for us to do business with America also on our terms.
Right. David, what are your thoughts? Will the second Trump term bring drastic shifts in U.S.-Africa relations?
Well, I don't think there will be a drastic shift as compared to his first term in office, considering the fact that he faces a different environment altogether. He faces an African continent which has, very good competition from other countries, the likes of China and Russia, who are providing a win-win partnership. You've got the likes of the BRICS. So the U.S. understands the strength of the African continent, not just in terms of trade and population, but its geopolitical significance. So I think with Congress, of course, the Republican being the majority in the Congress, and of course, which is the upper house and the lower house, it will be very difficult for the president himself as an individual to put the United States in a disadvantaged position as far as Africa is concerned. But it's not just about what President Trump-elect does when it comes to power. It's also about what the African countries and what the African leadership does in terms of how it positions itself, to the global economy, especially the U.S. economy. So, people are getting wiser. Countries are getting to understand their internal and sovereignty rights. So, he faces quite a stiff competition, not just from other partners, but also from African countries that are kind of, coming to understand that their sovereignty and their power to bargain counts.
So, David, and this also applies on the security front as well, because in 2018, the U.S. announced plans to reduce its military presence in Africa, but there are still U.S. military bases in several African countries. What might the Trump administration stance be on U.S. military presence in Africa, especially regarding counterterrorism efforts in regions like the Sahel?
I think the U.S., as in general, especially I talk about the fact that it's not just about the president, but the Congress and the lower house will be very interested to maintain U.S. geopolitical influence, especially in the Sahel, where the competition is strongest. I mean, the U.S. does not want to present itself to the global world as weak or as losing ground, as the case may be. They would want to ensure that, some kind of presence is gotten from the Sahel. President Trump, during his first administration, appeared, to be much more lukewarm towards Russia. Now, the question is, how is he going to negotiate that during this second term, bearing in mind that he's not, looking forward to a third term in office. So I think, in a good light, I would see African countries perhaps, having a better leverage, in terms of, security, in terms of partnership, perhaps with the U.S., but also, presenting themselves in a position where it can be a win-win. They can work with other countries that are presenting a good option for the goal of achieving peace, security, and stability. So this is where I think it's going to the position is going to look like. It's not going to be a situation where Trump or President-elect, will want to pull America completely out of the continent, because it's too risky. It gives America a blind side, and that's not what the American foreign policy in terms of security has always been.
So I'd like to get your final comment. Which areas of U.S.-Africa relations do you think would benefit from continuity, and which might be vulnerable under a Trump administration? Chris, you go first.
I think if you look at things like AGOA, and if it is now renewed, under what terms? So if you look at the trade space specifically, what priorities will the Trump administration put forward? You look at things like bringing manufacturing back to the U.S., the sort of policy priorities that a Trump administration would want to focus on. Would that then entail more stringent conditions in things like AGOA, which makes it more difficult for some African countries to qualify, and possibly remove some products that have preferential access to U.S. markets under AGOA? If you look at just in terms of how the U.S. tries to extend influence, if you look at the focus of the U.S. government on the African continent, I think you've got your wins, you've got your easy wins and some of your easy losses as well from the African perspective. So we'll need to see exactly how that plays out. But we could, I think, versus the rhetoric that we've seen from Trump, see quite a pragmatic administration where it realizes if it wants to secure U.S. influence and still have beneficial trade relationships and diplomatic relationships with African countries and African governments, it needs to engage possibly, even if it's just behind the scenes, in a different manner. Now, I know the rhetoric won't necessarily be in that direction, but maybe the actions will be different. I'll also mention, just announced in the last day or so, Ibrahim Rasool will take up the position of ambassador, South African ambassador to the U.S. in Washington. He had occupied that position before, so we're seeing maybe an element here from the South African side of trying to reestablish the intellectual capacity that was there before, those experiences and relationships, and maybe that will benefit things in the medium to long term.
Joseph, your comments?
Continuity, I think, as I said, Donald Trump's indifference to issues to do with human rights and democracy, that is definitely an area which is likely to suffer. And Trump's perspective on a question of climate change means that efforts, and both bilateral and otherwise, on the continent and through other agencies, whether it's the African Union or perhaps global partners through the UN, Africa will possibly suffer unless Trump advisors encourage him to realize that some of the things that he seemed particularly to reject or deny in this first administration, a reality, a global reality, which becomes, in any case, a global threat. I know a number of governments, not many, but many of whom are predominantly dictatorial, who are rather happy that a Trump administration means that they will not be patronized, as they say. So from that perspective, whether those governments benefit or not, I think, as issues to do with human rights and democracy, we'll sort of lose out. But I think, quite rightly, as my colleague has said, questions of strategic security are matters that possibly, whatever the person in the White House says, these are strategic matters that the administration officials and guys on the ground will advise the president that, look, some of these relations, particularly many of these that go below the radar, will continue. So strategic links in as far as security are concerned, whether you're talking about Central Africa, in the Horn of Africa, and indeed the Sahel.
David, you have the final word.
Yes, I totally agree. The U.S. administration, has a policy, and they've continued to, pursue that policy irrespective of whether it is, a Democrat or Republican that is holding the seat of power. And I don't see that changing much. Of course, I think one thing which President Trump has talked about, but I'll bet during campaign, is that, looking at the war in Ukraine, he has made it quite clear that if he were in power, that war, would not have happened in the first place. So I think the expectation is that, he may come in, albeit too late, perhaps to salvage, some aspects of the negotiation between Russia and Ukraine. And that goes perhaps, the same with the ongoing conflict between Israel, Gaza, Lebanon, and Iran. We are left to see what, how the Trump administration, President Trump-elect is going to deal with that. But all those conflicts, as you know, Beatrice, have a significant impact on the African continent, in terms of, either side, if you want to call it that way, wanting to win the hearts and minds of friends from the African continent. But the truth of the matter is the U.S. policy will not change significantly. The U.S. has its interest. President Trump-elect has talked about the United States first, which, of course, is something that he demonstrated during his first term that, he can achieve to some extent. But you can only be first if you reach out to the continents that matter, if you do business and trade with the countries and continents that matter, if there is stability and peace in the continents that matter, and that continent is Africa. If the U.S. doesn't engage with Africa, then I think the U.S. will not be first, as President Trump-elect talks about.
Gentlemen, indeed, thank you all very much. But that's all we have time for on this edition of Talk Africa. A big thank you to our guests, David Otto Endele, Director at Geneva Center for Africa Security and Strategic Studies, Joseph Ochieno, African Affairs Commentator, and Chris Hatting, Executive Director at the Center for Risk Analysis. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation online through our social media handles on Facebook and X. You can also catch the show on our YouTube playlist. Do keep the conversation going and join us again next week for more Talk Africa. For me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team here in Nairobi, until next time, bye-bye.